Thank you for being here. My name is Daryl Tippins. I'm the provost, as I mentioned this morning. Still, I'm the provost, I guess. Haven't been in my office all day long. There may have been a coup, for all I know. It's my great honor to extend a warm welcome to each one of you again and to introduce a special guest who will, in turn, introduce our featured speaker of the afternoon. As you know already, this conference would not be occurring. You would not be here for this occasion if it weren't for two very wonderful people, Guilford and Diane Glazer. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Diane to you, who will introduce our speaker. Diane studied political science and international relations at UCLA, where she graduated Phi Beta Kappa. She attended the USC School of Law and went into law practice for many years, working for Columbia Pictures. For several years, she had her own television program, The Diane Glazer Show, where she interviewed more than 500 world leaders, including people like Henry Kissinger, Al Gore, George Shultz, and the leaders of many countries, from such countries as Afghanistan, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and Israel. With her husband, Guilford, Diane has long been active in the LA World Affairs Council, where she is a very active board member. With her wonderful husband, Guilford, they together have blessed many good causes, encouraging goodwill and understanding among people all over the world. Please join me in welcoming Diane Glazer, our distinguished guest and benefactor to the Glazer Institute, who will introduce our speaker.
I want to get the mic in the right place. Is that okay? Can everyone hear? Okay. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here. And I'm delighted to introduce you this afternoon to Rabbi David Wolpe. He is an author, public speaker, and chief rabbi of Sinai Temple in West Los Angeles. His father was a highly respected conservative rabbi. David Wolpe was raised with a belief in God. As an 11-year-old, he had thoughts, he didn't really, of becoming a rabbi. I hope you did then. At age 12, he went to a summer camp where a group of youngsters gathered to view a short documentary depicting the inside of a Nazi concentration camp, where David saw images of thousands of gassed and starved corpses and skeletons of once living human beings, mothers, babies, children, and grandparents, all being shoveled and bulldozed into large holes in the ground. He walked out of that movie shocked, in disbelief that God would let this happen. What he saw at age 12 convinced him that there was no God. He turned his thoughts towards atheism. A few years later, he made his way to an Ivy League university where some professors taught that religion was inane. Religion was for people who did not know how to think. In an effort to work out his confusion alone, he took a bus trip across America. Eventually, he met a remarkable teacher who convinced him to study to become a rabbi. He became a teacher. The word teacher in the Jewish language also means rabbi. He taught at several institutions, including the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York and at the American Jewish University in West Los Angeles. And incidentally, that's where he met his wife, who was getting her MBA degree. Where, incidentally, I have it in here, he met his wife. Currently, he is teaching a course in modern Jewish religious thought at UCLA. Sadly, his family lived through some very tough times. His wife was diagnosed with cancer. Later, in 2003, he was diagnosed with a brain tumor. In 2006, he was diagnosed with lymphoma and suffered through months of chemotherapy, pain, depression, and the loss of all his hair. Over the years, Rabbi Wolpe he has written in many publications, including the New York Times, the Jerusalem Post. He frequently is featured on TV documentaries where he covers biblical and other topics. Some of you may have watched him on the History Channel. I love the program Mysteries of the Bible, and also on the Discovery Channel, or as a commentator on CNN, CBS, and the Today Show. Recently, Newsweek magazine named him the #1 pulpit rabbi in America. He is also the author of 7 books, including a national bestseller, Making Loss Matter. His latest book, Why Faith Matters, is the topic of his talk today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in warmly welcoming to the podium our guest, the Chief Rabbi of Sinai Temple, Rabbi David Wolpe.
So apart from thanking Diane for that beautiful and gracious introduction, I suppose I ought to begin by saying, yes, it grew back. I got this habit, I thought that I would mention, because this is a good ecumenical story with which to begin. I got this habit of taking my watch off when I speak from my father, and one day he told me this story about someone who brings a bunch of non-Jewish friends to the synagogue, and they watch what the rabbi does, and everything the rabbi does, he explains. He opens the ark, and he tells them what the ark is and what the scrolls are inside, and he bows down. He tells them why he's bowing. The rabbi gets up to speak, and he takes his watch off, and his friend says, "What does that mean?" He goes, "Believe me, it doesn't mean anything." So please don't be encouraged by the fact that I have time before me. I will ignore it to the extent possible. I want to begin by talking about one sentence of a critique of a man whom I admire greatly. His name was Abraham Joshua Heschel, and he was one of the leading Jewish theologians of the 20th century. And Heschel was one of those people who is, in the phrase associated with Spinoza, God intoxicated. Heschel saw God everywhere. Heschel woke up and felt like the world was flooded with radiance, and his books are these beautiful poetic evocations of God's presence in the world. A theologian named Arthur Cohen wrote about Heschel, and he said, in a line that I never forgot, that Heschel has no feeling for the tragedy of unbelief. And that, I think, is true of many religious people, that they are so filled with the conviction of God's reality that they don't, in two senses, feel the tragedy of unbelief. One, that it is genuinely inaccessible to people who want it. There are many people who really do wish to believe and seek to believe and try to believe, and yet they cannot. And the second is that there's a certain tragedy to lack of belief in the world that I hope to address in just a few moments. But I bring this up because I think, with really very few exceptions, everything I'm going to say about faith, loss of faith, the way faiths relate to one another, I think they are trans-denominational, trans-cultural, and this is certainly the case. Sometimes I think when someone comes up to me after a talk and says, I've always believed, I've never doubted, that faith is in its way a talent almost like musical talent. That is, certain people have an ear for faith or an eye for faith, depends on what metaphor you like to use, or a heart for faith, and it never deserts them. I have to tell you, I'm not among those people. I identify with what Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav said when he said, "I am a moon man. My faith waxes and wanes." And for many of us, perhaps for most of us, certainly in the 21st century America, we understand what it is to be moon men, or more accurately, moon people. Right? You lose the alliteration, but you gain the ecumenicism. So what it is to be moon men and women. That is, sometimes we feel filled with faith, but in an instant, as in what Diane spoke about at the beginning, you can lose it when you see tragedy, when you see pain, even when you see how very pedestrian the world is sometimes. And you can't believe that, in fact, this is a superintended and enchanted place because there's so much that seems to argue against faith. And yet, then, in a moment, your faith will wax again, at least if you're lucky. So, one of the things that I want to point out, and this actually seems to me is distinctive in a certain way to some traditions and not others, is that if you read the Hebrew Bible, and please understand that Jews, for reasons that may be clear to you, don't refer to it as the Old Testament, since that suggests a supersessionism that we're not on board with. But if you read the Hebrew Bible with an eye towards what it tells you to believe, you might be struck by the fact that nowhere does it condemn atheism. It never says the one who believes in no God is in trouble. It says, I'm the Lord your God. It encourages you to believe in God, but the only belief that it explicitly condemns, of course, is idolatry. Idolatry, which is believing in something temporal, that is something limited, as though it's something absolute. Right? And Heschel, by the way, since I mentioned Heschel, I will now parenthetically say something about Heschel, which is why the watch doesn't mean anything. Heschel has a beautiful comment about why it is that idolatry is not permitted in the Bible. He said, most people assume that the reason you're not allowed to make an idol is God is the only God, and you make this thing out of wood or out of stone, and you say it's God, and God gets insulted. He said, but look, God's really above that sort of insult. He says, that's not really the problem. The problem is that God created an image in this world. It's in every human face. And therefore, when you point to something outside yourself and say that's God, it's not that you're insulting God, it's that you're insulting yourself, and that you are not permitted to do. There is something, in other words, in the human being that is eternal. Not that we are God, which is a sort of New Age ego inflation that really doesn't mean very much, right? It's just a way of either reducing God or elevating ourselves. But not that we are God, that was just a drive-by. Not that we are God, but that we have an element of eternity inside us, and when we see things that aren't eternal as being eternal, we negate that specialness. Because the Bible doesn't, though, say anything about not allowing yourself to be an atheist, you have to ask yourself, what is its principal concern with belief? And here I want to present to you what I understand to be the Jewish approach. I would not presume to speak in the name of any other tradition. All of you will have to see the extent to which this accords or doesn't accord with your own religious faith. You can't measure belief. You cannot know what someone else believes. You cannot, as Queen Elizabeth put it so poetically, right, cut windows into other people's souls. All you can do is see belief enacted. That's all you can do. You can deduce from the way someone behaves what they believe or from what they say, but you can't see their belief. And so when we speak about what faith should be in this world, there's a part of me that thinks that really all we're talking about is how faith should be enacted in this world. Because I can't possibly know if you're fulfilling your religion, my religion's, your preacher, my preacher's expectations of what your faith should be. But I can measure whether you fulfill what the precepts are that your faith offers about how you should act in a way that would reflect your belief. So I'm mindful of the words of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who said in the 19th century, most people worry about their own bodies and other people's souls. But they would be much better off if they would worry about their own souls and other people's bodies. And if I could, it's a little big for a bumper sticker, but I think that if, in terms of understanding each other's traditions, if that were our primary approach, that is, to worry about other people's bodies and our own souls, we would be infinitely better. This is the same rabbi, you can understand his general approach, who, when his disciples talked about people who wouldn't get into heaven, said, "What makes you so certain that God will hand you the keys?" You can't know, right, what the ultimate disposition of the human soul is, but you can know in this world, how we treat one another. And the productive religious discourse, it seems to me, would be this theological enacting. That is, how our traditions teach us to treat each other, as opposed to purely how our traditions would have us believe, since we cannot ever know, granted the privacy of one's own mind and heart, whether what your tradition says is what you believe anyway. So I have 4 precepts about how to deal with unbelief, or how religion ought to meet unbelief, and one general comment about why I think faith matters. I just want to say, a lot of time. There are debates online with Stephen, I did one with Steven Pinker, but it didn't go online. 3 with Christopher Hitchens, and 1 with Sam Harris, and some others about belief and unbelief. And the truth is, they're fun, although not so illuminating. But essentially, the first premise that is impossible for unbelief and belief to meet on perfectly is the place of reason in human life. Because it is, and if you want to test yourself, this is my sort of test of whether you're religious or not. It's, as inadequate as any other quick test, but it'll do for the moment. If you want to know whether you have a fundamentally religious outlook towards the world, ask yourself if you see the world as a puzzle or as a mystery. A puzzle is something that is susceptible of solution. You may not be able to solve it, I may not be able to solve it, but it can be solved. That is, given a powerful enough reasoning machine, you can unravel the world because it's a puzzle. But if you believe that at the heart of the world there is an unfathomable mystery, something not only human beings, but even more intelligent creatures than human beings could never figure out because it is unfigure-outable, because it is a mystery, not a puzzle, because God is far greater in proportion to us. I mean, think about it. When you were 2 years old, could you imagine what an adult is? A 2-year-old has no idea even how to begin thinking about what it is to be an adult. Well, God is infinitely greater in proportion to us than we are to 2-year-olds. So for a religious person to pursue God by reason, as tempting and maybe inevitable as it is, right, is like Aquinas' famous dream, where he was emptying the sea with a teaspoon, and an angel asked him, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Theology." Right? The same idea, that is, the essential unfathomableness of the world is the first ground on which someone who is a doctrinaire atheist and a believer part. Because if you have confidence in human reason, then there are lots of reasons why faith doesn't work. There are reasons why it does too, and I'm not going to belabor you with a long disquisition one way or the other. But ultimately, of course, faith doesn't take its marching orders from the human mind. It assumes that there is a faculty in human beings not that is anti-rational, but that is other than reason, that can complement, supplement, turbocharge reason, but is not in the end reason, which is why religions make a terrible mistake when they feel that they have to fight the products of reason. The current religious move against the discoveries of science is not only counterproductive, but it's also counter-religious. Because it assumes that what religion gives you is a superior form of reason, but that's exactly what religion doesn't take its stand on. Religion takes its stand on something deeper, greater, more mysterious than reason, from which reason can build. And that, it seems to me, ought to be the first thing that religions ought to have in common, which is an essential humility about how much we can know. Not only how much we can know about the world, but even how much we can know about God's revelation to us, since, after all, even within all of our own traditions, there are competing voices about that revelation. And as soon as you take one stream of that revelation and make it, and you totalize it and make it absolute, you can imagine that it says more about the totalizer than it does about the tradition. Right? That's why, as again, Heschel points out, when you talk about revelation, in order for something to be revealed, what must it be first? Hidden. So he says, every revelation is a partial revelation. There is no complete revelation. And therefore, there are always things that are hidden, and that's why we keep arguing, among other reasons. So first is this humility, not only about reason, but also about the imperfections in all of our own traditions. And here, this is a painful but necessary part of interreligious discourse. And I want to say a word about it because it seems to me that there's something that afflicts all discourse, political, religious, that we at least ought to acknowledge even if we can't transcend it. And that is that the willingness to admit the imperfections in your own position is in inverse proportion to someone else being there who doesn't like what you have to say. In other words, I'll tell someone else inside my own tradition what's wrong with my tradition, because then I'm not conceding any ground. But you're afraid to do it in front of someone else because then I'm afraid if you don't reciprocate, my tradition has just lost a step and yours remains where it is. The same thing you see all the time in politics, right? Why is it that people will make no concession to the mistakes in their own position? Because they're afraid the other team will grab the concession and run with it, and they won't turn around and say, yeah, we have problems in our tradition too. So let me, at least in theory, advance the discussion by letting you know the wise words of a friend and colleague, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who said, I don't care what denomination of Jew you are, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, as long as you're ashamed of it. That always struck me as a very wise thing to say. So let me just, as a conservative Jew, there's lots to be ashamed of. Lots to be ashamed of, right? On a small level, on a grand level, but I suspect that that's true of every denomination, of every religion, and our inability to admit our shame because someone else will see it is at least as destructive as all the other manifestations of religious difference. Because you have to be able to say where you're wrong. Otherwise, there is no point to interreligious dialogue. You have to be able to say what you learn from other traditions that you don't have in yours or you don't have as strongly in yours. Otherwise, we really have nothing to learn from each other. All we have to do is boast to each other about the riches that we hoard. And that moves us nowhere. It moves us nowhere. So if we could actually engage in a dialogue, and not only a dialogue, but an enactment of the goodness that exists in the rituals and the social action and the social justice that exists in every tradition, If we could do that together, it would be, I think, much richer, better than if we had a theological dialogue when at the end we all go back to our individual huts and we know a little bit more about someone else, but we've not done anything with them. And after all, it is through doing that we come to know the other. The third point I want to say, and I've only got 4, so I'm really getting there, is I want to talk about a story that we all share, even though we tell it differently, and offer you an interpretation of it. And this is the story that in the Jewish tradition we call the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. It's called the binding of Isaac and not the sacrifice of Isaac because in the end, Isaac walks away. But the Akedah, which in the Quran, of course, occurs with Yishmael and in the Hebrew Bible occurs with Isaac, but for the purposes of this, doesn't matter who it was done to, okay? I heard a beautiful interpretation many years ago about the binding of Isaac and what it's really about. Now, this is a story that is endlessly interpreted, right? It's the 22nd chapter of Genesis. Here's one interpretation which doesn't invalidate all the other wonderful ones that you already know. The interpretation is that what God was doing was trying to figure out what it was that Abraham loved, his religion or God. Because what Isaac represented to Abraham was the continuity of the Jewish tradition. Right? Isaac was the only other Jew. He was Abraham's only son who would carry on his tradition. And God comes and says, get rid of your future and get rid of your tradition and listen to me. And now Abraham has to make a choice. What's bigger, your religion or your God? And the reason he listens to God is because he recognizes that God's bigger than religion. That statement is a statement that I wish every religion in the world would sign. That God is bigger than my religion. Because if we shared that at least, it would mean that there is an overplus. That is, there are things we don't understand. There are things that in our very traditions we may have gotten wrong. That God is bigger than our tradition, and therefore all traditions have a different piece. And that is right in the heart, I think, of that very difficult and problematic story. And Abraham obviously makes the right choice, which is why he gets to have both. Because if you understand that God is bigger, then you can be reinforced in your own path, as opposed to clinging to it, with that sort of desperate, clinging that will not let you let go because you're afraid of falling. In the same way that, in the Roadrunner cartoons, if you're old enough to remember them, they remember the coyote used to run off the cliff, and as long as his feet were running, he would stay up, but then all of a sudden, when he looked down, he would fall like a stone. So a lot of religious people remind me of that, right? If they actually take stock of where they are, they feel like they'll fall. But if you do fall, which I suppose we all do from time to time, then it is part of faith to assume that you'll be raised up again. The last is, having said all this, and then I'm going to end with a story, and then if we have time, I'd love to take some questions. The last is that having said all this ecumenical, we all share the same God, we all share the same things, having said all of that, I think you ought not to give up one iota on the peculiarities, eccentricities, idiosyncrasies, gloriousness of each of our own traditions. You actually don't have to give up to appreciate the other or work with the other. And here, I really think that what religion needs is both tolerance and pluralism. Tolerance is, you're wrong, but I'll allow you to say it anyway because I'm tolerant, right? Pluralism is, I actually can learn something from you. But pluralism doesn't necessarily mean that you have to give up parts of who you are. And here, I want to quote you, and I'm going to have to quote it more than once because it's not so easy to follow, but once you get it, it will lodge itself in your mind, I hope, as it has in mine, the wise words of the Kotzker Rebbe. This actually, who gave the I think, best definition in this season, in the 1800s, the best definition of codependence ever given, and since he would have been on Oprah had he only lived in the right century, but unfortunately, since he lived in Eastern Europe in the 1800s, he never made it. He said the following. He said, if I am I because you are you, then I am not I and you are not you. But if I am I because I am I, and you are you because you are you, then I am I and you are you. Okay? I'm going to say it one more time. If I am I because you are you, in other words, if I am who I am because you're here, if there were a different audience, if I'd give a completely different talk about the same things, if I am who I am just because you are who you are, then I am not I and you are not you. Right? Then I have robbed the integrity of the individual from all of us. But if I am I because I am I, if I am in fact who I am, and you are you because you are you, then I am I and you are you. And therefore, if we meet on the ground of our own uniqueness, then we're really meeting. If we pretend that we agree about things that we don't agree about, if we make nice because we don't want any conflict between each other, then we're violating not only our own integrity, but also the integrity of the other. because you assume that someone else can't know who you are and still accept you. You rob them of that possibility. This is what I tell the kids in school, that the reason you shouldn't lie is not just because lying is bad, but because by lying you make it impossible for someone to ever know you. They'll know a false you, but they won't know you. So if you misrepresent your tradition in an attempt to make it ecumenical, then you rob the other person of getting to know you. And of course, getting to know someone means getting to know the parts of them you object to as much as it does the parts of them that you love. So I want to tell one story that, to conclude, that I think is really the summit of our joint task, at least from my own perspective, and then I'll be happy to take questions or comments or objections or brief alternate speeches, whatever you like. A few years ago, a rabbi passed away whose name was Shlomo Carlebach, and he introduced many, many, many musical prayers into modern Judaism. And he used to travel around the world, and he would sing to communities. And he was a very light and beautiful spirit, and everywhere he would go, people would learn his songs, and they would sing with him. And I still have this memory, you know, of an assembly in high school. And you don't remember too many people who come to your high school, but I remember how he had the whole school up and singing. It was a wonderful thing, and he told years later the following story. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Rabbi Carlebach traveled to a small town somewhere in what was in the former Soviet Union. And he went and he did his thing and he taught them songs and so on and so forth. But he found a very unresponsive audience. Everybody closed the door either literally or metaphorically in his face, except for one man. There was one man who was open and welcoming and wonderful, and Carlebach spent the Sabbath with him. And before he was ready to leave the town, he said to the man, you know, I have to ask you a question. He said, look, I understand the feelings of the people in this town. After all, there's a tiny Jewish community left. First, they suffered under the Nazis, and then for 40 years under the jackboot of communism. Now, with the fall of the Soviet Union, they're even more impoverished than they were before, and they don't want to hear the singing rabbi from the West. He says, I understand that. What I don't understand, said Carlebach, is you. Why is it that you're so different? Why is your spirit so open when theirs is so closed? And the man said, I can tell you why, and I can tell you the exact moment that it happened. He said, look, I am an old man, and I have lived in this town my entire life. And I remember a night when I was a child before the First World War, and it was the dead of winter. And all through the town, a rumor spread that the Cossacks were coming. And they were going to loot and pillage and burn and destroy. So the parents of the town gathered up all the children and they brought us to the rabbi's house. And all night long, the children of our village were lying on the floor of the rabbi's study, of his kitchen, of his living room, as he paced up and down among the children all night, watching out over us. And I was curled up in a corner of the rabbi's study, pretending to sleep, but I couldn't sleep because it was bitter cold. And in the middle of the night, the rabbi came up from behind me and took his cloak off his shoulders and spread it over me and said, good child, sweet child. You know, said the man to Carlebach, it has been almost 80 years since the rabbi spread his coat on me, but it still keeps me warm. That's not a Jewish story, and it's not a rabbi story. It's a human story. It's what we can do for each other as children, as adults. It's what you do when you feed someone who's hungry, or you shelter someone who's homeless, or you give comfort to someone who is bereaved or alone. That's what we were put here to do. And because at our best, no one does that like people of faith, we understand that in this world, where there is emptiness and there is anguish and there is pain, faith really matters. Thank you. Thank you. I'm delighted to take questions. I think we have a few minutes at least. Someone will cut us off when we don't, if there are. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yes, please.
I heard once a debate between Dennis Prager at an atheist convention. And the atheist side said, first define God and then prove that that God exists.
Right.
And Dennis Prager was just dumbfounded, and the debate proceeded on railroad tracks going in opposite directions and not meeting. What was your experience in your discussions with Hitchens and Dawkins and Harris, et cetera?
Well, let me just say two things about that. First of all, I've known Dennis for many years, and the fact that he was dumbfounded is itself a miracle, and therefore proof that God exists, right? I got to tell you, I've had many talks over the years with Dennis. I have never, ever found him at a loss, not only for words, but for a cogent argument. What I would have said is that first of all, this is what I would have said, and then I'll tell you about my experience with, I would have said, look, the way you set up the premise presumes the answer. That is, faith doesn't actually work by syllogisms. It assumes that the human mind is capable of proving God, which, as the medieval Jewish theologian Joseph Albo said, if I could prove God, I would have to be God, right? You need to be infinitely more. So I would have said, that's like my saying to an atheist, prove by reason that there is no God. There's no proof that there isn't any more than there's proof that there is. It is, I would say, closer to an existential certainty than it is to a reasoned certainty, right? So my experience was different with the different people that I debated, but the essence of it was that to some extent, anybody who's sort of around the religion biz long enough knows the arguments on both sides, and the question is, can you come up with a more colorful or interesting way of framing it? And that's part of what it was about. That's why I say it was as much an entertainment as an enlightenment. But also, I thought that part of my task was, and I'll give you an example. I'll give you one example only because it reflects well on me. I won't tell you all the times that, right, he scored points. You can watch it on the web if you want. But for example, I saw that Hitchens had been going around saying, look how foolish religion is. It assumes that God had to tell us, at Sinai, that it's bad to murder, as though it didn't occur to anyone before that it was bad to murder. Religion presumes that God had to tell us at Sinai. So I was a little bit, okay, I'll admit it, I was a little bit waiting for him to say that. And when he did, I said, you should read the beginning of Genesis. It would do you good, because there Cain kills Abel and the Bible condemns him. Because the assumption is that, of course, people know that murder's bad. The difference is that when it's revealed at Sinai, it's saying not that murder is bad because it's socially bad or because it's evolutionarily bad, but rather morality is woven into the fabric of the universe. That's the purpose of Sinai. And that idea, like many of these ideas, you can't plot it on a graph. You can't prove it. What you can do is feel that it fits with the orientation of your soul, and you can enact it. That is, you can live it in a way that makes it real. For most people, religion is more a function, I'm going to go out on a limb here. This might not be true, but more a function of the quality of the people whom you meet who are religious than it is of abstract doctrine. That's what matters. Right? If you meet religious, for me, meeting religious people who seemed, when I grew up, I assumed that at a certain point, even though my father was a rabbi, I revered my father, he was a wonderful man, and I thought it was a great thing for him to do, but I assumed that most religious people were basically weak. That's why they need this crutch, right? But I, as a 17-year-old who needed no crutches and, and knew almost everything, when I started to meet religious people who I thought were as wise, as kind, as strong, as thoughtful as anybody that I met who wasn't, when I started to understand that the atheists whom I admired, in particular Bertrand Russell, led the most unenviable lives, to say the least, right? then I began to see religion as something that, as enacted, could change lives. And that's much more the issue, is whether you admire the people who are your religious role models. If you can do that, I think then religion makes sense. You know, unless an idea is wrapped up in a person, it doesn't have the same force. So that's why, for example, before I take this question in the back, that's why a question that you get often is, how do you feel about the fact that there are certain people in certain sects of certain religions, how's that for being mealy-mouthed, who think you're going to go to hell, right? Which is a question I get all the time, and my answer is, I'm not thrilled, right? It doesn't make my day, but the truth is, as long as you don't treat me as though I'm already there, right? I believe in what Martin Buber very wisely said when they asked him about the Messiah. Martin Buber was a Jewish theologian, wrote a great deal about Judaism and Christianity in particular. He said, look, I think we should stop arguing about the Messiah till he comes. He said, then when he shows up, we'll say to him, excuse me, have you been here before? He said, oh, he's not done. He's not done. He said, and if the Messiah is as wise as I think he is, he'll say, you know, I don't remember. So, we'll see. Anyway, yeah, there was a question in the back. Go ahead. Jess? No, sure. Thank you.
As someone who's been involved in the interfaith community for decades, I was especially intrigued by your suggestion that we get together and say what's wrong with our own religions. Okay, how would you set that up?
I'd make them start. I'll tell you later. I will tell you. Don't worry. I'll tell you. You can trust me. I'll tell you. But I just want to hear first. So I don't know. In all seriousness, by the way, about manna, it actually works very well in here. If I can just say, if I can detour to manna for a second. You know, the Bible talks about the test of manna. What's the test of manna? I mean, after all, it falls, you pick it up, you eat it. I mean, yeah, you're supposed to get twice as much and trust that it's there for Sabbath, but I think the test of manna is when it ends. Because that's when you go into Israel and you actually have to create a life for yourself. Right? It's the same thing as the same Kotzker Rebbe, whom I mentioned about I am I and you are you, that whole thing. He said something extraordinarily powerful about the Akedah, about Isaac's, the binding of Isaac. He said, he asked his disciples once, what was the hardest part of that test for Abraham? And he gave an answer that I feel fairly sure no one has ever given before or since. He said the hardest part of the test for Abraham was coming down the mountain. Because then he had to live with what he did. And it's much harder to live with what you do and to create a life than it is to act a certain way in a peak moment. So the manna was the peak moment. The question is afterwards. And what I would say is the only way to do, my prescription, in as much as I have a prescription to do that, would be to start by doing something together, because that's what builds relationships. If we had, here's an idea. How about a joint Jewish, Christian, Muslim soup kitchen? All you have to do is feed. All you have to do is feed. It doesn't matter, any kind of food you want. Who could possibly object to that? No political discussion, nothing, just a soup kitchen. People who stood on enough lines and fed people long enough, then they would be able to say at a certain point, you know what, I got to tell you about my rabbi, you know? I know you're safe because, you know, but that's how it started. I don't think you start off. It's like being on a date, right? You don't start off by saying, let me tell you everything that's wrong with me, right? You wait for dessert. So the same thing, Yes, please. So the question was about the brain tumor and the cancer. I want to tell you what the condition is so that you understand when I say what I'm going to say. My wife had cancer that we have one child. We have one daughter. She's 12 years old. She couldn't have more children, but she's essentially cured. The brain tumor was a seizure. I was speaking at an event, and I had a seizure and then a brain tumor. It turned out, this is a long story that you don't need to hear, but I'd be happy to tell you, but you don't have time, turned out to be benign. The lymphoma will return, though. The lymphoma we're not done with. I was put into remission, but I have a kind of lymphoma that doesn't go away. At least there is at present no cure. my feeling was, and the reason I brought up that I have a daughter is that I think when you get sick and you have a child, it's a different experience because you have a responsibility to the child in terms of how you handle your sickness because she's watching. And one day, long after I'm gone, when I hope, when she faces whatever crisis she faces in her life, she may need that. And this is what I kept thinking. No, I have to say it didn't diminish my faith in God at all for two reasons. One is I don't think God works that way. I don't believe that God doles out bad and good depending on moral behavior or anything else. I think there's a lot of randomness in the world, and what I asked God for was strength. I asked my doctors for medicine. I asked God for courage and for strength. But the other reason was, look, let's be honest. By sitting in this room, we are among the 99.9% luckiest people who ever lived, right? I mean, I know that everybody has their individual tragedies, and some of them are truly terrible. But if you were born after antibiotics and dentistry, that kicks you up already to like the 96th percentile, right? Indoor plumbing, 98th percentile. Okay, so granted, maybe Twitter puts you back down 97, but I mean, let me just speak about myself. I thought to myself, I was born to two loving parents in the second half of the 20th century in the richest country in the world. I never went hungry. I never fought in a war. So what I realized was people always come to my office when something bad happens, and I understand it, and they say, why me? And I understand that question. But people never come to my office and say, I have a wonderful family and a loving spouse and a great job. Why me? But that's at least as good a question. So I was worried for her, but I realized that, the truth is I've been extraordinarily fortunate, and it's not fair, if you will, it's not fair to God to say everything good you give me I deserve, but the bad stuff, why me? Why would you pick on me, right? So if you take a step back and you have a sort of eagle's eye view of our lives, we're incredibly lucky. So no, I didn't feel aggrieved. I felt worried, concerned, scared, all the normal feelings, but I didn't think that it was God's responsibility to clear this up. Also, because if you're a clergy and you have a large enough community, you've seen a lot of really, unspeakably awful stuff. So it a little bit takes away your willingness to say, I understand. It's like there's an old Yiddish joke, dear God, you do favors for perfect strangers, how about for me, And that idea that God should, it's okay what you do for them, but for me, you ought to be better. I couldn't and don't buy that. I really think that the fundamental religious emotion ought to be gratitude. The fundamental religious emotion. Lots of other things play into it, but just for existence, for the bounty and beauty of existence, we ought to be grateful.